Hello, I've decided to start doing a series on creating retro art for video games. Whenever you take on a new project, I strongly encourage that you begin by doing some research. So that's where we're going to kick this off. All right. So I'm going to primarily focus on the NES and Super NES type era because that's kind of when it really hit strong and pixel art grew into its own medium. Before that, it was there, but it didn't capture things quite as well as like the Super NES did or the Sega Genesis. That's when the technology and the memory and the processing was able to keep up enough that it really could be pushed into its own art form beyond what it was limited to before. Now, there were still limitations which kind of defined the styles, and by doing research on those, that's going to help you better replicate the things that you're trying to make. So let's start taking a look at it. The first thing is when you start looking at some of these systems to understand what the specifications were, you're going to be coming across conflictory information. For example, if I look at the NES systems, it'll say 256 by 240, but then it'll say, hey, 256 by 224. There is thankfully an explanation here. They didn't used to have quite so many explanations, but I'm glad that websites are starting to pick up on the need for that. The reason for that is that the TVs of the time generally had a resolution of 256 by 224. At least that's in the US. If you were in Europe or someplace else, those resolutions could change as well. But in the US, it would be 256 by 224. But the game systems themselves had a resolution of 256 by 240. Now, what did it do with those extra, lines of pixels? Well, it still rendered them, but they were just off screen. And then they would just be cut when you brought it in. This is kind of true across a lot of these systems. And what you're going to find is that even though there are wildly varying specs, they still worked on a 256 by 224 screen resolution. So even as I jump to Sega, so the Super NES, it says the same thing, 256 by 224. On the Sega, you have a couple different resolutions, but they kind of all point to that 320 by 224 or 320 by 240. This is where people can get confused. They had different resolutions, but they all had that net output for that 256 by 224 for the screen. In the same way, a lot of games now can be done at different resolutions, but we generally tend to output at the 1080 or in some cases with more modern games at the 4K resolution. So these were kind of standardized resolutions. Okay, so if I'm looking at this kind of retro, that's what I'm looking at. If you look at older systems, they have similar types of resolutions. They will also have their own specifications. So there's a difference between the Atari 2600 and the Commodore 64, and you can see those resolution differences, but they're all roughly in that same size and scale, and that gives you a good idea of what you're shooting for with the art. All right, so that brings me over to some of this information. What were the actual differences? What was it that made it look different or the same? So I could have a game that played on screen at 256 by 224, but the difference between like the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was dramatic. Well, what caused that? Let me shift over here. I apologize, I'm kind of getting stuck on this for a second. Because this is fighting me for just a moment. I apologize, let me get this selected really fast. Eek. Oh, okay, here, let me make one final change and then it'll hopefully work a little bit better. There we go. Okay, now I'm here. All right, so the thing that caused that change was not the resolution, which is what a lot of people that are first getting into this art get confused about. It was actually the ability to store things in memory, so having more opportunity for additional sprites, which created cleaner animations, as well as the memory to handle larger color palettes. So to give examples, this is from Mega Man 1. These are some sprites that were pulled from Mega Man 1. for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Having some technical difficulties. There we go. And these are sprites, if I zoom out, from Mega Man X for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And if you'll notice, there is quite a difference here. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. In the same way, if I look at these sprites that are from Final Fantasy I for the Nintendo Entertainment System versus these sprites from Final Fantasy VI for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. In the US, it was called Final Fantasy III, or released as Final Fantasy III, but it was actually the 6th game in the series, so Final Fantasy VI. They look pretty different quality-wise, but the scale is roughly the same. So here it is an example. Here's one of the characters from Final Fantasy I, and here's Edgar from Final Fantasy VI. They were the same size. The difference was that ability to have an expanded color palette. When you're limited on your colors, you end up with blocky, posterized looking things. And then the more colors you could add in, the higher the resolution could be. Same thing with the animations. The animations would feel kind of stiff and blocky because they were limited by the number of sprites they could have as part of an animation cycle. They didn't have a lot of room, so they had to make it work. And on older systems, it was even more difficult. That's why you don't see big, lush animations on the old Atari games. Usually it was just one position, second position, one position, second position. That was it. You had 2 sprites for a wiggle. It was based on the amount of memory that they could handle. All right, so we have these with limited sprites, and then we look at the newer stuff once we got to the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, and suddenly we could have these much more complex walk cycles, run cycles, shoot cycles, and then even customized animations with characters doing really cool things that we just didn't have the memory for before. And that's why for me, Super NES was that golden era when it just kind of came to fruition. Anyway, so those two things, the ability to have more sprites, more variations, as well as the ability to have more color, helped create the styles that we were able to see in these games. Now, for those times, it was like, hey, we got this stuff and we're expanding. Now, if we're going for a retro look, we actually have to create those same limitations for ourselves so that we can get our art to look like this, because those limitations are what caused it to look that way. Beyond that, then it's looking at style. And that's where this gets fun. Each of these started to become its own art form. It was no longer just, how do I represent something on screen with this limited amount of pixels? It's, hey, we've got enough pixels now. What's the style we're going to go for? Final Fantasy was awesome because they had an artist, Yoshitaka Amano, that helped to define the concept art at the beginning. Same thing, you look at Chrono Trigger, pretty famous artist. If you've seen Dragon Ball Z or anything like that, you kind of know his work. They started getting real artists that would come in and help define the styles that, even though they were represented in pixel format, started to be pretty powerful. You could tell better stories and have better visuals for that. Okay, so jumping over here, trying to make sure I'm in the right place. So looking at games like Chrono Trigger or others, you can start to see how these different styles were approached. There were some similarities because of that limitation, but no one would mistake a character from Earthbound with a character from Secret of Mana, because they were able to be much more unique stylistically. And so it's looking not just at the characters, not just looking at what the limitations are anymore, like how many colors can I have, what's my palette, but really how did they create this? How did they put this together? Now, as artists, for anybody who's watching this, it's an artist, I'm going to encourage you to do what's known as master studies, master drawings. In in the same way you would do that with traditional art classes where you study from the masters and then try and recreate it with your own drawings or your own paintings, you can learn art the same way for this format. Look at how people created art for these games, start to dissect that, and start trying to recreate it. So I encourage you to do that. But let's take a look at this as an example. So this character, Chrono, if we look at how he's created, we can start figuring out what scale he is. I know you're not able to fully see this, so I'm going to switch over to a fuller screen mode really fast. Let me widen this just a touch. Jump to this full screen mode. Okay. So if I marquee select, I can start figuring out roughly what size this is. I can start figuring out the character's area and what area they were working with. So this is 34 pixels tall, and depending on what I'm looking at, it may go higher or lower. So I'm going to get this one that seems like it would be the tallest of them, and that's 38 pixels tall for this run. And it's not very wide for this character at this moment, and maybe some of the side views will be a little bit different or longer or whatever else. But this gives me a rough idea. So if I know my max is about 38 pixels, I know roughly the area that I'm working with to try and recreate this. Okay, so my character is somewhere between about 36 to 38 pixels. If I look back over here at this character, Edgar, and I check this out, 24 pixels tall for all of these Final Fantasy characters. So those are the restrictions I need to work in to be able to create a character that's in that style. Apologize, had to stop for a second for children exploding in the background. So back to it. So Edgar, 24 pixels tall. I think I'm just repeating myself, but getting caught up after that. All right, so these are the things that we're looking for to figure out what this actually is stylistically. So I'm looking at what are the limitations. The limitations are I need this specific type of scale to work within the style. The next thing is the shaping and how it's approached. I'm looking at some of these characters, and this is a specific viewpoint as opposed to, if I come over here to Edgar again, while Edgar does have 3/4 views, most of these are from a flat side view, as opposed to this one over here, which is a little bit more of that like 3/4 angle down, like the Pokemon 3/4 angle down style. And so that slight angle change will make a difference to how you approach the character, which will change the style. If you look at this character, he also has a very distinct silhouette. Edgar a little bit, but a lot of the Final Fantasy type characters kind of fit within that blocky shape, and then they had some stylistic changes. So that's part of theirs as well. Versus this, where each of the Chrono Trigger characters had a very distinct silhouette for their character. So you could tell, even if I blacked this out, where it was a single solid color, I could tell the difference between Chrono and Marl and Robo and Frog, okay? That's a big part of the distinction of this style. The next thing is how I approach the coloring of this. The way that the pixels are being used to define stuff. I had another example that I probably lost. Nope, there we go. There we go. So this is a character from Seiken Densetsu 3, would have been Secret of Mana 2 in the US. Wasn't released at the time it came out in Japan as Seiken Densetsu 3. But it has recently been released as part of a Secret of Mana trilogy. As I'm forgetting the name, but yeah, so I encourage you to check out that trilogy Secret of Mana game that you can get for the Switch now. Amazing game. So I had to import this from Japan to play it when it came out. But the characters were very distinct with the way they approached it. Same type of thing. This one has a little bit more of a flatter thing. By the way, all three of these were made by Squaresoft. So now the names have changed over the years a lot, but it was Square, Squaresoft, all that stuff. Amazing company during the Super NES days, and had a lot of fantastic games that were visually distinctive and a lot of fun to play. But even from the same company, three similar but different styles. So let's take a look at these. I'm going to drag this over so I have all three of these together really fast. Sorry, let me drop this in right there. Oh, it's going to make my life difficult. There we go. There's that one, and that one. Okay. So with these characters, as I'm looking at them, and I'll actually shift this one over a little bit later, let's look at how they're approaching it. The number of colors that they're using to create transitions and how they're approaching transitions. So this one is fewer pixels. This is only 24 pixels tall. That limitation means I don't have as much room for creating gradients across the hair. And so this one is just kind of stylized to give a hint of what that hair is going to be. The hair is defined by this, goldenish color. It's got the darker color, the darker brownish color, and then a highlight. So really three colors for a transition, and then the black squares for the outline that then lead down into the face and the body. So this is how that hair is being handled. With Chrono Trigger, the same type of thing. They've got their main color, which is that orange. They've got that lighter red that is acting as kind of the transition color, the gradient leading into the shadows. They have the more maroon color down here that acts as the shadows. They've got the gray color for the outline of the character, but if you notice, that's not being used inside the character. So that's another defining feature. Same thing here on the cloak or tunic or whatever, or not cloak, the tunic he's wearing. They've got one color that defines the interior line work, but then a different color to define the border for the whole character to help them pop from the screen. And then the highlight color for the hair. So we're dealing with only a few colors of transition across the hair. All right. Now let's look at this one. Let me look at Chrono again, looking at that size. So if Chrono is roughly 32 pixels tall, except for the stretch points where he's like climbing, where it stretches out a little further. 32 pixels tall. How tall could this be? Because this seems to have so much more detail. 32 pixels. Okay, so we're working still in roughly that same space, but the approach is a little different. Chrono is focused on this silhouette and being a little bit more thin so that other areas can be exaggerated to follow the original concept art. This character is a little bit more blocky and built out, which allows for more area, so they don't have quite as distinct a silhouette. However, the trade-off is that they have much more lush color transitions, even though these are also still minimized. There's still that blue, which is defining the hair color, that highlight of yellow, the purple, which is acting as the start of the shadow, that gradient transition, and then the darker purple to act as the shadow. In this case, they're also adding in the black color for a border transition between sections, between the hair and the face, and then from the face down into the body, and then the section between arms. They are not, in this style example, using it to create a dark border outline. Okay, so that's different than these other two. This has got a lot of black in here to create an outline as well as interior changes. This one is using the darkest colors strictly for an outline, and this one is using it for interior transitions and not for an outline. Okay, so I'm starting to see how they are creating their art stylistically. How are they approaching the characters? How are they approaching the texturing? Okay, all of this is just a continuation of what we began with in this talk. You need to do your research first to figure out how it was made, why it was made. As I said, take some time to do some research on stuff that you enjoyed. What game systems did you like? What video games specifically would you like to recreate the art of? In order to do that, you need to understand how and why. Do research on the systems, find out the specifications. What were their color palette limitations? How did they handle transitions and layers? How did they handle alpha channels? Let's talk about that very quickly before I finish up. These old systems did not have gradient alpha. That means you couldn't have partial transparencies. A pixel was either on, completely opaque, or it was off. That was it. Most of you are thinking back going, no, I swear there were clouds of things that could cover. Yes, in the same way a newspaper could use a film with dots on it to cover up something to add a gradient, or you may have seen manga artists that have like cut out things to create that. If you turn off every other pixel and have basically 50% density, that ends up having the end effect of looking like a partial gradient. If you have more pixels that are turned on, looks a little more opaque, less pixels turned on, a little more transparent. But the reality is it's either on or off. And so that's a way that they handled partial transparencies. Anyways, these types of things are things that you can research and find. But look at specific games that you enjoy and go beyond just the size and the color restrictions and things like that, and then start dissecting the style. Why does it look the way it looks? How can you recreate it? And then an extra challenge for you, try and recreate it. See what you can do. Do your own master paintings and master studies of your favorite games. Start by recreating the characters as they are, and then see if you can do your own variations of the characters, environments, props, things like that in your own way, but using the same stylistic approaches that they were using. Anyway, I'm going to end this video here. In the next video, I'm going to come back and start taking you through the technical approach of how you can actually do this. Like how to use the tools and things like that. We're going to use Photoshop as the primary tool for this, but there are other software that you can get to use. I'll leave this video here, and then in the next video I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. Anyways, see you in a bit.